In July of 1987, Elias and Nora Monroe stepped aboard a cruise ship bound for the Caribbean and were never seen again. No distress signal, no blood, no signs of struggle. The cabin they were staying in 7B looked like a hotel room waiting for new guests. But it never did. 8 years later, when a drifting yacht surfaced off the Gulf of Mexico with Elias's stethoscope and Nora's passport sealed inside, I reopened the case. What I found buried in audio tape sonar readings and a name not found on any manifest changed everything I thought I understood about disappearances at sea. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from down in the comments and hit that like and subscribe if stories like this have ever brushed close to your own family. Every click helps bring another cold case back into the light. My name is Anna Ruiz. I worked missing persons for 23 years in Charlotte, North Carolina. I was never the kind of detective who liked the spotlight. I took my cases one at a time, tried not to get too close. Tried not to let the missing follow me home. But some cases don't let go. I first heard the Monroes' names in the summer of '87. I was only a few years into the job back then. Elias was a cardiologist. Nora worked in pediatric oncology. They were well respected, private. The kind of couple who'd bring casseroles to a neighbor's funeral but skip the block party. They weren't the type to take vacations, especially not cruises. But according to their younger brother Marcus, something had changed that summer. Elias had been quiet for weeks. Nora kept a notebook she never let out of her sight. Then, with just a few days' notice, they booked 2 last-minute tickets on the Ocean Splendor. It was the ship's final voyage before dry dock. 1 week through the eastern Caribbean out of the port of Miami, Marcus dropped them off. Said his brother smiled a little too long at goodbye. Nora joked about the buffet. If anything happens, Elias said blame the shrimp. He always was the type to undercut tension with a joke. They boarded that ship at 4:42 p.m. on July 18th. Ship logs confirm they dined alone that evening, table 14 near the starboard window. A cruise photographer snapped their picture. In it, Nora's hand rests on Elias's shoulder. Both are smiling. Not big, just enough. That photo would later become the face of the investigation. I didn't see it then, of course. I was assigned the file years later after it had gone cold. But something about that image. I kept it tacked to my office wall. It looked too still. Too perfect. Like a moment posed for memory, but already touched by absence. By July 21st, 2 mornings later, they were gone. But we didn't know that yet. All anyone saw at the time was a clean cabin. Beds made, luggage untouched, a jewelry box still closed, 3 folded letters blank, and 1 disposable camera. But before we even reached that, there was one other detail. A steward filed a maintenance report on the 20th, the night before the Monroes vanished. He said someone had jammed open the balcony door from the outside. Salt mist had crept in, left a thin sheen on the table near the window. No one followed up. The next morning, the cabin looked pristine again. But something had come through that door, and whatever it was, it didn't leave the same way it came in. It was the steward's report that stayed with me. Not the blank letters, not the untouched bed. It was the detail almost no one followed up on the balcony door slightly pried open from the outside, then closed again. Not forced, not broken. Just opened long enough for salt mist to leave a trace, and closed without a sound. I didn't know what that meant back then. I only knew that on July 21st, 1987, when the Ocean Splendor docked briefly in Nassau, Elias and Nora Monroe didn't get off the ship. They didn't show up at breakfast. They didn't attend the late-night jazz show the night before. Their room hadn't been touched since the afternoon of July 20th. The sheets were still tucked, toothbrushes still dry. Their keycard hadn't been used since 5:47 p.m. that Monday. At first, no one panicked. It's not unusual for guests to sleep in or miss an event. But by noon, the crew began to worry. They knocked. They called. When there was no response, a junior officer opened the door with a master key. What they found was a room in perfect order, luggage stacked neatly, Elias's wristwatch placed beside a hairbrush still holding a few strands of blonde hair. Nora's jewelry box was untouched. Her shoes were still lined along the base of the closet. No signs of struggle. No spilled water. No blood. No note. Just two empty spaces where people should have been. Captain Harold Clean reported the incident as per protocol. His tone, according to the Coast Guard's logs, was irritated more than concerned. "I've run 211 voyages without a single man lost," he said. "If someone disappeared, they brought it with them." That line would stick out to me years later when I finally took over the file. At the time, the investigation was handled by Lieutenant Commander Rachel Monroe, no relation to Elias or Nora. She boarded the ship in Miami on July 25th and conducted a full walkthrough. Her notes were clean, organized, precise. No surveillance footage on the exterior decks. No record of the cabin door opening after 5:47. No pool activity. No event attendance. No room service orders. No witness statements of any disturbance. She ordered divers to inspect the ship's waterline. Had every crew corridor and supply closet searched. Nothing. The ship had returned from its final voyage just as it had left, without incident, without interference. Except 2 passengers were missing, and no one could explain how. Back in Charlotte, Marcus Monroe answered the door when local police knocked. The house was quiet, almost staged. Framed pictures lined the hallway. Elias and Nora, frozen in happier times, at a fundraiser, a beach vacation, an old graduation photo. The kitchen table held 2 half-drunk mugs of coffee. The fridge still had a bottle of wine opened the night before they left. Marcus told investigators there had been nothing unusual. Elias didn't have enemies. Nora had just received a major grant for a research study. The cruise had been booked last-minute paid with points from a pharmaceutical conference. He asked me to check the mailbox while he was gone, Marcus said. Then he hesitated, like he wanted to say more but didn't. That pause would haunt him for years. A few days later, the case was officially classified as a presumed loss at sea. No evidence of foul play, no remains, just 2 names on a passenger manifest and a silence that didn't sit right. But then on August 2nd, something surfaced quietly and almost by accident. At a small photo processing center in downtown Miami, a technician named Leonard Voss was developing rolls submitted by the cruise company. Tourist photos mostly. Sunsets, pool decks, smiling families. But one roll caught his attention. 3 images. Slightly underexposed, likely taken indoors. The timestamp handwritten on the envelope said Cabin 7B Roll 3, developed on request. Voss looked closer. The first photo showed Elias near the balcony, his face unreadable. Nora stood behind him, one hand resting on his shoulder. They weren't smiling. The second image was of an empty hallway taken from inside the cabin. There was a shadow in the corner, too tall, too narrow. Hard to say if it was a person or an object. The third photo was a mirror shot. Elias and Nora, blurry off-center, standing in front of their bathroom mirror. But behind them, in the reflection, was a shape. A silhouette. Taller than both of them. It had no features, no face, just the faint outline of something standing where no one should have been. Voss set the photos aside, tagged for pickup by the cruise company. No one ever claimed them. 9 days later, Detective Ruizmi received a manila envelope at my station mailbox. No return address, no fingerprints. Inside was a photocopy of the mirror photo. A single sentence was written across the bottom in pen, "Look closer." They weren't alone. I requested the original negatives. I had the photo analyzed. The text said the angle of the mirror didn't match the interior of the cabin. It reflected more than it should have, like it was bending around something. Or something was bending it. No defects on the film, no light leaks. But the image didn't sit right. I didn't put the copy into the official file. I slid it into the back of my drawer and left it there. I wasn't sure what to do with it yet. 2 weeks passed. Then Marcus Monroe called the station. He'd been cleaning his brother's office when he found a letter tucked between 2 medical journals. Folded, not sealed, the letter was addressed to a man named Dr. Malcolm Foster. The name rang a bell. He'd collaborated with Elias years earlier on a neurological research study. The letter read, "If anything happens during this trip, you'll know where to look. You warned me once that some doors shouldn't be opened, but I opened one anyway. And so did she. Don't trust what they'll say. The file isn't in my office. It's where we first met. Underneath the plaque. Same key. If it's still there, burn it." The signature matched every other sample of Elias's handwriting, but no one knew what it meant. I flew to Baltimore the following week and met with Foster in person. He looked tired, chain smoker, nicotine-stained fingers. I gave him the letter. He read it twice, then, without a word, walked across the room to a wall plaque, First Principles in Practice, 1978. Behind it was a hollow, empty. "He was right," Foster said. "It's gone." I asked him to explain. He said there had been studies early field testing for cognitive suppression using cruise ships as unregulated testing environments. The theory was that isolation motion and environmental pressure could alter memory perception, even time sense. He mentioned a neurologist named Dr. Vin Anuen, a contractor who vanished in 1985, last seen boarding a cargo vessel off Panama. No trace since. Some of those studies, Foster said, went beyond ethics. On the flight home, I reread the letter. It wasn't a goodbye. It was a warning. Elias and Nora hadn't taken a vacation. They'd stepped into something far more complicated, and whatever it was, had started long before they boarded that ship. What none of us knew yet, not me, not Marcus, not even Foster, was that something had already started to return. Something drifting, watching. And on a foggy morning in 1995, a patrol cutter in the Gulf of Mexico would make contact with a vessel that should not have existed. But that's where we'll go next. It was just before dawn on September 12, 1995, when the Coast Guard cutter Callahan picked up something unusual about 40 miles off the dry Tortugas. A white pleasure yacht drifting without lights, without signal, and without anyone on board to wave for help. Chief Calderon, a seasoned radar tech, flagged it first unregistered, no AIS transponder, no distress channel. The crew assumed it was abandoned or damaged, but the moment they pulled alongside, they knew it was something else. There were no scrapes along the hull, no burns, no crash marks. The yacht looked nearly pristine except for the algae film clinging to the waterline. I got the call that afternoon from a friend at the Miami Coast Guard station. He didn't say much, only that I should get down there and bring my Monroe files. By the time I arrived, the yacht had already been impounded under a mid-level anomaly protocol. Nothing explosive, nothing urgent, just strange enough to require quiet paperwork. Inside, the team had logged 2 duffel bags, both water-damaged but intact. In one, a stethoscope engraved with E. Monroe, a pack of unopened medical journals, and 2 passports issued in 1986 to Elias and Nora Monroe. In the other, a sealed marine-grade container marked for retrieval and tagged with a clearance designation I didn't recognize DRK-level access. It was locked with a biometric reader. Tucked between the cushions of a narrow bench, wrapped in a clear sleeve, was a photo. That photo would become the first real piece of proof I'd seen in 8 years. It showed Elias and Nora standing on a dock, likely in Miami, before the crews dressed casually, arms touching. But behind them, almost blurred mid-motion, was another figure. Tall, mid-turn, dressed in a black blazer, face obscured. On the back of the photo, written in ink that had faded but hadn't bled, were 5 words. "We never left the ship." The file reopened that same day, not publicly. The Monroe case had long since been filed under missing persons and quietly forgotten by the press. But internally it was pulled from archives and given a new classification incident R876. I wasn't assigned. I wasn't even active at that point, but someone slipped me a call late that night from a blocked number. The voice didn't introduce themselves. They said, "You were right, but it's bigger than the Monroes." Then the line went dead. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I received an invitation, if you can call it that, to meet with someone from the Department of Civil Maritime Recovery. The name was unfamiliar, but the return address on the envelope was a P.O. box in Arlington, Virginia. We met at the Raleigh Public Library Archives Wing, neutral ground. His name was Adrian Keller. Clean suit, barely blinked. Looked like he could have passed for a junior associate at a tax law firm if you didn't know better. He laid out a briefcase, opened it, and slid over a folder. Inside were digital scans of the yacht's inventory, the stethoscope, the passports, the photograph, and something new, a transcript of an audio file pulled from the marine-grade container. "We don't know where we are." The transcript began. "The lights haven't stopped flickering since yesterday." Nora's still hearing the tones. "We tried to turn back, but the compass keeps spinning." It was Elias's voice, faint recorded under strain. "Every attempt to contact the Coast Guard fails. It's like we're not on any frequency anymore. If anyone finds this, tell our families this was never a vacation." Then static. Then a second voice, Nora's, quieter. "They're not letting us leave. It's not the ship. It's underneath it." I pushed the folder away. Keller didn't flinch. "There have been others," he said. "Not many, but enough." The next day I drove to Johns Hopkins, hoping to find anything that might give that audio context. I remembered a name from Elias's research circle, Dr. Evelyn Carr, a neurologist who had co-published several papers on cognitive impairment linked to sensory deprivation. She'd left the university years ago, but her manuscript notes were still held under restricted archive access. With enough phone calls and a firm tone, I was granted 1 hour in the restricted reading room. I asked for Box 14A. Inside 4 handwritten journal entries and 2 anatomical diagrams, all dated May through June of 1987. The first entry was measured. Academic. Elias wrote, "Our understanding of external stimulu's role in spatial orientation is flawed. Isolation may not dull cognition. It may rewire it." The second entry was shakier. "The cruise study may be compromised. Passengers are describing the same dreams, always a structure beneath the surface. A tone. Nora heard it last night. She won't admit it." By the third, the writing had deteriorated. The words looped tighter. "It's not breakdown. It's transmission. The ocean isn't quiet. It's broadcasting. And the final one, we are inside a closed system. This isn't a route. It's a loop. Something else owns the current." Folded at the bottom of the box was a sealed envelope marked, "Do not publish, destroy after reading." I opened it anyway. Inside was a short note unsigned, but in Elias's unmistakable hand. "To whoever finds this, you were never supposed to know. The sea doesn't forget, and what it holds it only gives back when it's done watching." There was also a sketch. Crude. Ink bled in the corners. A cruise ship drawn from above and beneath it. Something massive. Tentacled. Organic. It didn't have eyes. Just an open space where a face might have been. I drove home that night with a photocopy of the journal and the sketch tucked in the lining of my coat. Back in my apartment, I placed the image on my kitchen table and stared at it for a long time. Whatever Elias had found, it wasn't theoretical. It had changed him. And it had touched Nora, too. But that wasn't the end of it. Not yet. Because a week later, someone else appeared in the case file. Someone who'd been written out for years. A retired Coast Guard officer who'd gone quiet right after the yacht recovery in 1995. His name was Dean Holloway. And when I knocked on his door that October, he opened it without surprise. "You're here about the Monroes," he said. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. He already knew. And what he told me that night changed everything. He didn't ask to see a badge, didn't bother with small talk. Just opened the door, looked me up and down once and said, "You're here about the Monroes." His name was Dean Holloway, former Chief Petty Officer, retired in early '96, a few months after the yacht was recovered. His house sat at the edge of a fishing town in Biloxi, one of those single-level homes that felt more like a bunker than a place to live. Curtains drawn, window AC running even though it was barely 70 out. He poured himself a bourbon. Didn't drink, it just held the glass like it anchored him to the table. "I'm gonna regret this," he said, then leaned back in his chair. We weren't supposed to tow that boat back in. Official protocol would have been to log the coordinates, mark it as abandoned, and let salvage contractors handle it. But that morning we got a direct call from someone claiming to be with Homeland. Said there'd be a vessel. No name, no beacon. If we found it, recover it, no questions. I asked him if he remembered who gave the order. He just shook his head. Didn't come through any channel I recognized. But that wasn't the only call. A few hours later, we got a second one. No ID, no voice recognition. Just a male voice saying, "If the name Monroe is found, you didn't find the boat." That's all. He paused, let that settle. We found their name all right. On books, on medical gear. And that photo, the one that's been floating around the file all these years. I asked him if they filed the second call. He laughed, dry, quiet. 3 hours later, one of my guys, Phelps, had a seizure. Said he heard something humming in the hull, something that made his teeth ache. Never had a seizure before that. Didn't step foot on another vessel again after that day. Retired same month I did. Holloway rubbed the side of his jaw like the memory itched. I tried to report it. My draft was pulled before it reached the final folder. Got called into a meeting with 2 suits I'd never seen before. Told me if I liked my pension, I'd stop asking questions. I asked him about the sealed container. He nodded. Yeah, we weren't allowed to open that either. Same goes for the hatch. That was new. I asked him what hatch. He hesitated, then got up and pulled a file box from a hallway closet. Inside were personal logs, mostly routine stuff. But one photo was tucked behind a maintenance sheet, grainy, low-resolution, time-stamped from the yacht inspection. It showed the interior of the main cabin wall near the sleeping quarters. A metal panel, circular edges fused into the wall with no latch. That wasn't standard, Holloway said. Didn't match the vessel's build specs. We were told not to touch it. Said it was not for surface personnel. I sat in silence. I had spent 8 years looking at this case from the outside in. Now I was starting to realize how many layers were inside that boat, sealed, cataloged, and left to rot in classified storage. Holloway finally took a sip of his bourbon. "I've hauled up wrecks before. Pulled bodies out of life rafts. Watched a man burn to death in a fuel flash. But that boat..." He shook his head. "That boat felt like it didn't want to be found. I left just before midnight." He handed me a photocopy of the hatch photo and one more note, something he'd written in '91 but never sent. It was addressed to a senator never mailed. A sketch map of the Atlantic grid, handwritten notations, and a red X placed off the Bermuda Ridge. A caption beneath it read, "Something opened beneath the ship. It didn't close when we left." 2 days later, I revisited the Monroe case archive. I was looking for a detail I might have missed, something buried too deep in the early paperwork to have seemed important then. I didn't expect to find much, but inside Elias's travel journal, tucked between 2 folded itinerary sheets, I found a handwritten boarding ticket. Not digital, no barcode, just ink. Name E. Vale. Same cabin 7B, no passport, no payment. Just a seat assignment for the captain's gala dinner. At first I assumed it was a prank or an abandoned alias. But the passenger list from the Ocean Splendor retrieved from storage after the investigation was closed did include one peculiar line. A third chair marked Reserved Vale. I ran the name through every database I had access to. Nothing. No family. No prior travel. No identification anywhere in federal or maritime systems. I drove out to interview the ship's onboard photographer, a man named Alan Ditt, retired, now living just outside Tampa. He remembered the Monroes. Said they were polite but quiet, didn't pose for many photos. When I mentioned the third chair, his eyes shifted a little. Tall guy, he said. Didn't smile. Wore gloves at dinner, pale as paper. I asked if he had taken any photos of him. No, he never agreed to them. Would leave the table when I walked by. I pulled the photocopy of the mirror image from the Monroe cabin, the one where the silhouette stands in the reflection behind them. Ditt stared at it longer than I expected. That's him, he said. That's Vale. It was hard to breathe for a moment. I asked if anyone else had mentioned him. Ditt nodded. Couple of stewards. Said he gave them the creeps. Never saw him eat. Never saw him go to his own cabin. He was always just there. I went back through the original crew notes. Found one incident log from a steward named Greg Atwell dated 2 days before the Monroes vanished. The report had been buried in non-critical personnel entries. It read, I don't believe the man in 7B is a registered guest. He doesn't speak. He appears at the window when I pass, even in the middle of the night. Something is wrong in that cabin. That log was signed. 2 days later, Atwell was marked as missing. Crew record said presumed overboard. Body never recovered. I added a new line to my evidence wall that night, wrote the name Vale in bold, underlined it twice, then added, not listed, not logged, not gone. I didn't know what he was yet, not a guest, not a crew member. But something about his presence shifted the trajectory of the entire voyage. And if Holloway was right, if something had been opened beneath the ship and hadn't been sealed again, then whoever Vale was, he may not have boarded like everyone else. And he may not have needed to. The longer I stared at that name Vale, the less sure I was it even belonged in the same category as passenger. There was no trace of him in the ship's official records. No entry scan, no customs paperwork, no purchase trail. But there he was, seated next to Elias and Nora at the captain's table mentioned in 2 independent logs and reflected in a photograph that no one should have been able to take. I'd worked enough disappearances to know when someone wanted to vanish. But this didn't feel like evasion. It felt like intrusion, like someone had stepped into a space not meant for them, or maybe someone who'd always been there waiting for others to join. I couldn't stop looking at that image. The mirror photo. The grainy, slightly warped reflection where Elias and Nora stood side by side and behind them that shape Vale. His outline too tall, too still. The light didn't fall on him the way it did on them. And something in the angle of his arms relaxed, but not human, made your eyes keep returning to it even when you tried not to. I had it digitally enhanced, but nothing surfaced. No facial features. No distortions that explained it away. But what came next made the photo harder to dismiss. On October 21st, I transferred the analog cassette from Charlotte Monroe's box to digital format. The tape was warped with long stretches of static, but after cleaning up the interference, I played it through twice. It opened with a click, someone activating a recorder, and a long pause before Elias Monroe's voice came in raw but steady. If you're hearing this, it means I couldn't contain it, he said. My name is Elias Monroe. He sounded thinner than he had in other recordings, not panicked, but tired in a way that went deeper than sleep. We boarded under our real names. Nora wanted it that way. Said if we were going to disconnect, we should do it fully. No aliases, no contact, just each other. There was another pause. I could hear water in the background, either waves or pipes. The first 2 days were calm. It felt normal, almost like we'd left it behind. But then he appeared. Elias didn't say the name at first, just called him the man. Said he showed up at dinner unannounced, uninvited. Said he didn't eat, didn't blink much. He said his name was Vale. Knew where I studied, where Nora had done her fellowship. Knew things we hadn't shared on the ship. Details from our childhoods. Nora, Elias said, started having dreams, the same one every night. A hallway that narrowed the further she walked with mirrors on both sides that fogged when she passed. By day 4, the ship had changed, Elias said. Not physically, but the way sound moved. The way reflections bent. The clocks started disagreeing with each other. At one point, he woke up at 2:08 a.m. and checked the hall clock. It read 4:13. The sky outside was a uniform gray. No stars, no moon. Just a dull haze. And Vale was standing outside the cabin, Elias said. Not moving, not knocking, just watching. He said he found a hatch propped open near the kitchen corridor, one that wasn't on any crew map. He followed it into a sub-level space with no lighting, but somehow he could see. There was a chamber, circular. The walls were breathing. Not literally, but they moved in a rhythm. And in the center, a pillar of water suspended like a tube. It spun slowly. Something was inside. He didn't describe it. Just said it didn't have eyes, but it saw me. And then one more line. It said, "You were meant to find me." The recording cut out for a moment, then resumed quieter, shakier. We tried to leave. Told the crew we were disembarking at the next port. But the stars didn't move. The navigation screen was frozen. The engine hummed like it was running, but we weren't going anywhere. Then came the knock. Vale. Elias said he came to their door, knocked once, then whispered through the crack, "Only one of you leaves." Elias didn't say what happened next, just that when he woke, the ship was empty. No guests, no staff, no Nora. The cabin was intact. His belongings were still there, but the ship had gone silent. "I found a lifeboat," he said. "Don't remember how I got off. Woke up drifting. A vessel with no flag picked me up. They fed me. Didn't ask questions. Dropped me off near Nova Scotia. The last thing he said before the tape ended was, 'Tell Charlotte I'm sorry. Tell her the ocean took more than our bones. It took our names.' I played it again. Then a third time. Not because I didn't believe it, but because I didn't know how to write it down. The details matched every piece of data I'd found. The dates, the structural anomalies, the tone Nora reported hearing, none of it was random. And the phrase, 'only one of you leaves,' that wasn't metaphor. That was ritual. The next day, I drove back to the Coast Guard station in Portsmouth. I asked to review their 1993 salvage report from the Nova Scotia wreck recovery. It had been marked as a non-identifiable cargo vessel. But when I flipped to the physical evidence log, one Polaroid caught my eye. The hull corroded, battered, but unmistakable. You could see the starboard panel had been split from the inside, almost peeled. Another photo showed a dining room. Plates still set, one with food still on it, sealed under layers of salt and pressure. A third showed a lifeboat still docked, unused. The final image made me stop. A locker, door open. Inside, a uniform. Folded, dry, with a name stitched above the chest pocket in fading thread veil. I wrote one line at the bottom of the report, just for myself, the guest we never counted. Never. That night I got a call from a former recovery tech, Cooper Hall, who had been on the 1993 retrieval crew. He said he couldn't talk long. Told me he kept something he shouldn't have. When I met him the next day, he brought out a box from the back of his garage. Inside was a water-damaged audio recorder tagged for evidence, but never logged. It had Cabin 7B written across the tag. On the side of the recorder, etched into the metal casing, were two initials, EM. I didn't play it right away, just held it. The weight of it. The smell of salt still in its casing. This wasn't theory anymore. It wasn't speculation or foggy recollection. Someone had left breadcrumbs, had risked everything to pull pieces of this thing to the surface. And I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever Elias and Nora had found, whatever it had done to them, wasn't finished. Not yet. Because even now, pieces were still surfacing. And somewhere out there beneath the static, the voice hadn't stopped calling. I waited until after midnight to play the tape. Not the one from the cabin recorder. I still wasn't ready for that. The one I listened to that night came in a padded envelope slipped under my motel room door. No label, no return address. Just a note paper-clipped to a mini cassette. It said, "You were right. Cabin 7B was never empty." I threaded it through my analog deck pressed play and sat back. At first, it was just static. Then a low thrum. Not electrical, not marine. More like breathing. Wet but rhythmic. The kind of sound that doesn't come from a machine but from something alive that's been waiting too long. Then a voice filtered through layers of compression. Female. Halting. Fragmented. "We never reached land. They won't let us surface. We still remember." The tape ended after 22 seconds. I played it 5 times in a row. The voice sounded like Nora. Not the version I'd heard in wedding videos or conference panels. This voice had degraded, but the cadence was hers. The consonants still rolled the same. She was struggling to form syllables like someone speaking through water, or someone who hadn't used her vocal cords in years. The next morning, I called a technician I knew in Charleston, someone I trusted to run audio isolation without asking questions. His name was Andrew Tulliver, worked nights at a NOAA relay station, mostly logging seismic channels and dead frequencies that hadn't picked up a pulse since the Cold War. When I told him what I had, he didn't hesitate. That night, we ran the waveform through a stripped-down processor. No cloud backups, no digital imprint. What emerged wasn't music. It wasn't even a distress call. Tulliver stared at the spectrograph readout and said, "It's a location marker. A repeating signal buried just below the sonar threshold, pinging every 72 hours from the same coordinates off the Bermuda Ridge inside a zone labeled unmapped trench. No shipping lanes, no dive permits, no depth readings. The buoy dropped there in 1989 had never returned data. I requested a physical maritime chart, the kind printed on thick parchment. When we triangulated the source between the Monroe Yacht Recovery Site, the last known ping from the Ocean Splendor, and this new signal, it formed a near-perfect triangle. In the center was a zone marked only by 4 words. Do not broadcast here. I held my breath when I touched the circle. The ink felt faintly waxy, like it had been sealed over. I didn't say much after that. Just packed the chart and left Charleston before sunrise. I drove straight to Norfolk and met with a retired Navy sonar officer I'd been chasing for weeks. His name was Commander Peter Greaves. He used to run anomaly analysis out of a facility tied to Operation Neptune Vale, a short-lived program decommissioned in '91 after several listening posts along the Lusitania Ridge went dark. He was skeptical at first. Thought I was chasing a bad copy of a ghost signal. But when I played him the tape, the one from the envelope, his entire expression changed. He stopped it halfway through and said, "I've heard this before. Not exactly, but close. April '87. Lusitania Ridge. Same harmonic range, same modulation style." I asked him what happened. He took a long breath. We logged it as an unclassified marine tectonic disturbance. But that was just the cover. The signal had phonetic markers, partial language, emotional cadence. He glanced at me. A linguist named Carla Wexler flagged it, said it wasn't an echo, it was a message. Then 2 months later, she vanished. They said she resigned. I don't think she did. Greaves gave me a thumb drive with encrypted overlay files from 1987. The waveform matched mine almost perfectly. 8 years apart. Same voice, same phrasing. We still remember. I drove for hours that night with the windows cracked just enough for the sound of the road to keep me grounded. I didn't go back to the motel. I didn't want walls. I sat at a closed pier north of Virginia Beach and listened to the tide roll in. I kept thinking about Nora's voice, how it reached me not by telephone, not through a dream, but through a tape no one admitted to mailing. And it didn't ask for help. It just confirmed what I had been afraid to accept. They were still alive, not alive in the way we understand it. Not just breathing or waiting, but present. Aware. Speaking through means we couldn't explain. I went back to the tape from the cabin recorder the next morning, the one Cooper Hall had kept in storage for over 2 years. I hadn't been ready before, but now I needed to know what Elias left behind. The casing was warped from salt exposure, but the tape inside was still intact. I threaded it through the deck, clicked the lid closed, and hit play. This one opened with silence. Then Elias's voice came through softer than the last recording. Anna, if this reaches you, I want you to know I didn't leave her. The mention of my name caught me off guard. I rewound it and played it again. Anna. Not a guess. Not a coincidence. A direct address. I tried. But the ship, it doesn't sail. It drifts. And below it there's something else. Not built. Not found. Just there. Like it always has been. And it listens. Not with ears. With memory. There was a pause. A rustle of fabric. Then, tell Charlotte I'm not the same. And tell her, Nora still holds my hand. The deck clicked. End of tape. I sat with that for a long time. Not because of the words, but because I finally understood what they were trying to do. They weren't just reaching out. They were mapping a return. Somewhere beneath that trench, inside a space the Navy had labeled unmappable, something was making room for them again. Not physically, not by distance, but through signal, through memory, through whatever medium still existed between voice and silence. That night I requested access to an independent research vessel out of Azores. It wasn't official. It wasn't sanctioned. But if the signal was still broadcasting every 72 hours, then someone had to go listen in person. Not because we'd find them, but because I didn't believe they were lost anymore. I believed they were waiting, and something else was waiting with them. The nearest to was a small oceanographic vessel with a quiet crew and more rust than polish, but it moved steady through deep water, and that's all I needed. We left from the Azores at dawn, no official manifest, no backup team, no one to report to. The captain, Lionel Ashby, was ex-Navy and didn't care much for pleasantries. When I handed him the coordinates, 39.1 degrees north, 30.7 degrees west, he gave me a long look, said nothing, and nodded. We reached the perimeter of the trench just after 9 a.m. The water was unusually flat. No birds, no chop. The sun hung low behind a bank of clouds that hadn't moved in hours. There was no wind. Just a thick, suspended silence that made even the crew walk slower. I stayed topside as Ashby prepared the submersible. Aqua R1 was an old but reliable deep-sea unit, fully enclosed, pressure-rated for extreme depths. Ashby checked every system twice. Then he climbed in, sealed the hatch, and began the descent. The feed came through in static-flecked bursts, grainy black and white footage from the sub's external cam. At 7,000 feet, the landscape was expected flat, basalt, scattered debris fields. But by 9,000, the terrain began to change. Sharp angles, ridged patterns that didn't match any known geologic formations. "Looks like fencing," Ashby muttered through the intercom. "Grid lines. Not natural." I asked him to pan slowly. He did. What came into view didn't belong on the ocean floor. A vertical slope too smooth, too clean, and embedded in it a panel. Metallic. Rectangular. Just large enough to be a door. There's something stamped in the upper right corner, Ashby said, angling the camera closer. Looks like a number. No. Letters. Unit 7B. The moment he said it, the feed stuttered, then froze, then went black. We lost all contact. Ashby's comms dropped. The sub's tether signal disappeared. No alarm. No pressure spike. Just silence. We ran diagnostics for 5 straight hours, rebooted the transceiver, checked for thermal output, nothing. It was as if the sub had never been there. I asked the crew to drop a sono buoy before we pulled out, pre-programmed to record for 72 hours and transmit on analog channels. They hesitated but didn't argue. We left the site at nightfall. On the way back, no one said a word. Back on shore, I didn't file a report. I didn't call NOAA or the Navy or anyone who might reroute that signal into storage again. I booked a room outside of Ponta Delgada and waited. 3 days later, just past 2 a.m., the sonobuoy transmitted. The signal came in low, almost buried, but it was there. I played the feed through a shortwave receiver, static, pulsing tones. Then a voice. Male. Familiar. Anna. Anna. Listen to me. I froze. It was Elias. Clearer than any previous tape, as if the sound had traveled through something that stripped out the water, the weight, the time. If you hear this, we're still here. They took the surface from us, but not the memory, not love. There was a pause, then his voice cracked slightly. Tell her Nora still holds my hand. The line cut out. I played it again. Then again. It wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't a looped message left behind by someone long dead. It was recent. And it knew my name. The timestamp matched the exact hour the sub vanished. I sat in the dark and tried to measure the weight of that. They weren't echoes. They weren't dreams. They were signals. Intelligent, directed, personal. I packed up my gear at sunrise and caught a red-eye to Washington. I didn't tell anyone why. Just left a note at the front desk and took the long way back. 2 days later, I received another envelope. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of classified correspondence dated July 19th, 1987. It was a memorandum from the U.S. Coast Guard to the Atlantic Division Commander. The subject line read, Incident 817A, Doctors Elias and Nora Monroe. The letter confirmed what I had suspected but hadn't been able to prove. At exactly 20:06 hours, July 17th, 1987, the Ocean Splendor had transmitted a 6-second encrypted audio burst. The waveform matched black-coded transmissions previously logged in Sector 8C, same as the signal I'd just recorded. 2 hours later, the ship ceased all communication. No beacon. No explanation. Surveillance showed electromagnetic interference within a half nautical mile radius. Orders from Washington followed, do not engage, do not pursue, archive under discretionary protocol. At the bottom of the page, handwritten in faint ink, was a note. I don't care what they say. The ship wasn't empty. The audio contained a name. It said, Elias. He was still alive when it happened. No signature. Just a scratched-out symbol. Delta 8C. That memo had been buried for 8 years. Now it had found its way to my hands. Someone wanted the truth found. Someone else, I was sure, didn't. I placed the paper beside the photo from cabin 7B, the one with the mirror. In the reflection, Elias and Nora still stood. And now I knew whatever had taken them hadn't silenced them. It had only changed the way they spoke. Because beneath the deepest part of the Atlantic, something was still listening. And once every 72 hours, it let them speak back. When I finally returned to Washington, I didn't bring any files through the front door. I left the tapes, the chart, even my badge in a bank vault rented under a name I barely recognized as my own. All I carried into the city was a single manila envelope folded tight in my jacket, its corners soft from being turned over and over between my hands on the flight. I spent the next 3 days alone, ignoring my phone blinds drawn, not answering knocks at the door. My thoughts circled around the same fixed points: Elias's voice in the signal, Nora's name whispered at the edge of a sonobuoy transmission, the fact that the government had known and had chosen to do nothing but classify, redact, and suppress. The case had grown far past anything I could submit in a report. This was no longer about 2 doctors who vanished on a cruise ship. It was about what happens when a country, maybe even a species, decides it's safer to bury the truth in the ocean than risk what might crawl out if you brought it to shore. On the 4th morning, I got a call from Dr. Alina Wilcox, the marine geophysicist I'd met at Woods Hole. Her tone was clinical, but she didn't waste words. "Anna, we ran a new analysis on the echo you recorded. It's not random. It's a request for contact. That site isn't dead. It's waiting for someone to answer." I asked her what would happen if we responded. She was quiet for a long time before saying, "I don't know. But the ocean's a strange place to keep secrets. It never forgets." The same day I got a tip from a journalist I barely remembered meeting at a conference years back. She said there was a civilian diver in Puerto Rico, Carlos Mendoza, who'd made a discovery off the shelf near the Atlantic Trench. The government had dismissed his claims, called them attention-seeking. But he'd kept dive logs, VHS footage, and a stack of notebooks no one had bothered to translate. I booked a flight that afternoon. Mendoza lived in a rented room above a boat shop, the air heavy with salt and oil. He was wary at first, but when I mentioned the pattern of signals and the name Monroe, he relented. We watched his tape together on an old TV perched on milk crates. The picture was grainy, green-tinged, wavering, the camera strapped to Mendoza's own helmet. At first, just the sweep of the flashlight, the distorted bubbles, the hiss of his breathing. Then the camera caught it, a metallic shape on the ocean floor, smooth, curved, utterly out of place. There was a hatch welded shut from the inside. "That's what I found," Mendoza said. "Not a wreck, not rock. Something made." I asked him what happened next. His mouth tightened. "I don't remember surfacing. I remember a voice in my headset. Not English, not Spanish, not anything I know. Then I woke up in the boat, bleeding from the ears like someone had pressed sound into my skull." He handed me a folder of dive charts. The coordinates matched the ones from the buoy signal. They offered me money, a job, some contractor from Maryland. When I said no, they kept coming. I left everything on the ocean floor. I copied the dive site, thanked him, and promised to keep his name out of anything I wrote. He shook my hand, then said, almost as an afterthought, "Some places aren't for us. Once you knock, you never know who's going to answer." I flew home that night, my mind racing with questions I couldn't ask out loud. It felt as if everyone who touched this case ended up haunted, silenced, or swept aside. The next morning, a package arrived at my P.O. box. No return address, just a brown padded envelope. Inside was a mini cassette labeled Echo TX871. A sticky note. "You were right. Cabin 7B was never empty. The signal was the same as before. But now, beneath the voice, I heard another Nora whispering, 'Please, this isn't where we're supposed to be.'" It didn't sound like a plea for rescue. It sounded like someone lost in a maze calling back to anyone who might recognize her voice across years and miles. The implication was impossible to ignore. The Monroes had not simply vanished, nor had they died by accident or malice. They'd been intercepted, caught in some kind of echo chamber at the bottom of the world, their memories looping in transmission, preserved or corrupted by whatever was down there. For days, I tried to puzzle out what to do with all of it. Report it. No one would believe me. Leak it. That would get people hurt or worse, dragged into something they could never crawl out of. So I did the only thing I could. I copied every piece of evidence, stashed backups in 4 different cities, and sent one set to Dr. Wilcox with a note. If I disappear, keep listening. The sea doesn't forget. It only waits for someone to answer. That was the lesson I'd learned from Carlos from Ashby, from every survivor and witness whose story was cut short. There are places out there quiet, patient, hungrier than we'll ever be ready for. I closed the files. I unplugged every device in my apartment, took a long walk past the tidal basin, and told myself I'd reached the end. But the next night, just before dawn, my phone buzzed. It was another call with no ID. The voice on the line was old, cracked, nearly lost in the static, but I recognized it as someone from the Navy detail who'd once flagged the original Monroe case. All he said was, "You're not alone in this." Then he hung up. I stood there, phone in hand, heartbeat thudding, and realized the truth. If I was hearing the echoes, someone else was too. Maybe they were waiting for the same thing I was. Not closure, not justice. Just a signal, a sign that memory could reach back even if it never truly comes home. I don't know if the ocean ever gives back what it takes, not really. The days after the last signal felt quieter, not just outside but inside me, as if some tide I'd been following for years had finally run its course. I made peace with the evidence, knowing there'd always be gaps. Names redacted, voices swallowed by static, a handful of coordinates scribbled on old charts that no one was ever meant to find. I kept waiting for the phone to ring again, for another box to arrive in the mail for some sign that the Monroes, or whatever they'd become, were reaching out one last time. But after a while, there was just the old hum on the tape looping in the background like the world's oldest heartbeat. I still think of Elias and Nora Monroe, how their story twisted through the years and touched so many who'd never met them. Sometimes I picture them standing together in that impossible place beneath the Atlantic, hands linked in the dark, not lost, not silent, just held in memory by me, by anyone who ever stopped and listened. I think about Marcus, who spent half his life chasing closure that was never meant to come, and about Dr. Wilcox and Commander Ashby and all the others who carried pieces of this case with them long after it left the headlines. Some of us healed by walking away. Some of us stayed close, letting the story settle quietly into our bones. I learned that not every answer brings relief. Sometimes the truth just asks you to sit with it quietly and let it change how you move through the world. There are days when I want to go back to take one more shot at solving what can't be solved, but I remind myself the sea keeps its own counsel, and so do we. I still check the sonar feeds, sometimes still trace my finger across those old maps, but mostly I remember the people. How even in the face of loss, we kept listening, kept reaching, kept loving in our own ways. If you've followed this story to the end, maybe you'll understand why I keep a light burning by my window, even on the calmest nights. Memory is stubborn. Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes just bearing witness is enough. If any part of this story stayed with you, I hope you'll leave a comment or share it with someone you trust. Stories like this, quiet, complicated, unfinished, deserve to be remembered. Because even if the echoes never quite fade, we can make sure no name gets left behind.